Okay, next slide. So first of all, as I have introduced before, we have this platform supported by both China and Africa, and this is the first session. And this session, we're going to have two speakers. The first one is the leads of the nature initiatives of the Center for the Nature and Climate of the WEF Beijing Representative Office, Dr. Zhun Chunquan, who is in charge of the nature initiative of the Center for Nature and Climate, including the Tropical Forest Alliance Nature Agenda Actions and 1 Trillion Trees China Action and the China Nature-Based Solutions, or MBS, to build communities to leverage public-private cooperation to improve the management of the global commons and to build sustainable markets for 2030 agenda and carbon neutral and carbon positive transformation and changes in China. And he used to be working as the chief representative of the Chinese office of WWF, and he is also the lead of the programs for Yangtze River Protection Program. So this is the first speaker, and the second speaker, we will invite the research from the research and Lindsay Lewis, researcher and advisor of the programs of the ACB, and the third one is Mr. Zhang Gaomin, researcher and Institute of Botany of China's Academy of Science. And later, before the speech is delivered, we are going to introduce him in detail. So we will move to the agenda directly. First of all, I'd like to invite Dr. Zhu to share with us the topic about the relationship between the agricultural sustainability and biodiversity. The floor is yours. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hong. And I'm very happy as the member of the platform and as WEF to introduce my research and my observations regarding this topic. This is very good platform in pushing forward the support and assistance to the research and the attainment of the biodiversity targets from the aspect of agriculture. So today, I'd like to share with you my points, which is about the transition of food system for nature positive agenda. And actually, the transition of food system has great contributions to the nature positive development or agricultural food production diversity. And first of all, let's take a look at the slide about the food system. For food system, we must be very familiar with this system very much. There are some new figures I'd like to declare a little bit in here. Around the globe, sorry, there's a noise from some speaker. Okay, the portion of the land area suitable for the living occupied by agriculture is only 50%. So for the food system, actually created about 8 trillion USD of the values in the world, supporting the 71% of the habitat land. We have 71% of the habitable land. And for the developing countries, especially African countries, and also Asian countries and Asia Pacific regions, because these areas and these continents are mainly specialized in production in agricultural products or food production. So they are the major contributor of the food in the food system. In here, from the food production all the way to the consumption, in between, there are the packaging, processing, packaging, transportation, and distribution of the food, and all the way to the end users part, that is consumption part. The food system actually includes all areas or all sectors associated along this value chains. And it has a huge impact on soil, on water and on all kinds of natural sources. 1 cup of coffee would consume 140 liters of water. And if we consume 1 kilogram of beef, then it will consume at least 60, or it will emit at least 60 kilograms of the carbon dioxide or carbon-related pollutants in the atmosphere. So this is the basic concept. So WEF, the World Economic Forum, is supportive the food diversity as well as the FAO's initiatives for the biodiversity development, the targets development for the biodiversity, as well as the development for the food sustainability in the world, food, land, ocean use system, and infrastructure. And the third one is the energy and extractives. So these 3 areas would have at least 80% of the impact on the the endangered species, or the species which is almost extincted. And we have to try our best to eradicate the pressures and the stresses on the biodiversity right now. So for example, the food, land, and ocean use, its impact account for at least 72% of the total threats. And there are some overlaps of the threats represented by these 3 areas, but almost all of them, or 3 of them, are the major or the dominant threats to the biodiversity, including food biodiversity. So food system and biodiversity has a very close link with each other. And in many sectors, we can see some of the areas which has been mostly affected by the food production system. And the food system, this is the food system and its impact on the biodiversity in China. The high yield croplands in China account for about 1/3. So it means that the farms and croplands right now in China is highly threatened and endangered. So right now, we can see the fishing catches right now is not allowable and not reasonable right now in China. And China's offshore fishing has gone 50% over its annual allowable catch. China's contributed 22% to the global consumption growth in agricultural products between 2001 and 2018, almost 1/5. And Chinese urbanization is very fast. In this process, we can see like the consumption from the demand side is very high and increasing very fast. In this whole process of the transition, the waste of food is also a very severe problem in some of the cities. For example, overpackaging issue in China could be very serious. About 17 million to 18 million tons per year of the packaging materials will be consumed every year. And for the food system, how do food systems affect biodiversity? Probably you will get used to the situation. You will eat 3 meals per day, but how will your 3 meals affect biodiversity in the nature? And we have to clarify the information from the scientific perspective. Around the globe in 2019, there are actually clarification and reports from the platform about the 3 categories or 3 direct drivers of biodiversity loss. Number 1 is the changes in land and sea use. And due to the demand from the food consumption, and also the spaces occupied by human beings, and the changes of the uses of the habitats, and also the land use, which has very huge impact on the biodiversity and the sea use or the ocean use. For example, to develop the crop lines along the coastal area, surrounding the coastal areas, and this would also have a very huge impact on the ocean area. Number two, direct driver is pollution, which is the most direct. And another most direct impact is coming from the direct exploitation of the organisms. And invasive species are also very, very important issue that we would attend to, but due to time interest, I will not dwell upon this part. And from 2019, we have released a report detailing on this issue. So why food system had a relation with biodiversity? Because the food system is the driving force for the changes of the utilization of the resources, both on land and in ocean and in everywhere around the globe. So it's fair to say that, as I have alluded to just now, more than half of the land is used for cropland or cropping. And the changes and conversion of the land uses would make a huge change from the original purposes of the use of the land to some other purposes, like the land could be used for cropland purposes. But actually, 80% of the land has been utilized in some other purposes from its original purpose already. And in the different zones or the climate zones of the world, in the tropical zones, especially the lands for the tropical zones, for the rainforest, for example, has been somehow reduced step by step or even stringently and very spikingly in some areas. And it's fair to say that this is a very severe problem that we have to cope with in this very particular zones. And there are some figures that can prove the situation. About 6 million hectares of the land in Southeast Asia, the land use has been converted to other purposes instead of forestation. And the deforestation situation in some particular countries could be very severe. But of course, the food system versus the direct use for the exploitation of the wildlife resources. This two has a very direct relations, because right now we can see there is a lot of situation of the wildlife resources exploitation and the consumption of the water directly, and also the exploitation of the fishery resources directly, and even cropping the plants like the Chinese traditional herbs. And this could be used as the raw materials to process and produce some other products or finished products for consumption purposes. For the freshwater consumption, 70% approximately 70% of the global freshwater consumption is used in agricultural sector to support food production, basically. But actually, the water scarcity is a very severe problem in front of us. On the one hand, we have to produce the food product to satisfy the demand of the human beings. On the other hand, we have to maintain and conserve the water. And the other issue is the pollution caused by the pesticides and chemical fertilizers and caused by the agricultural waste and from the industrial production. At the same time, the utilization rate of the resources is also very important, especially when it comes to the pollution caused by the pesticides and the chemical fertilizers. This is really unreasonable and ridiculous to see the excessive use of the pesticides and chemical fertilizers applying on those crops in the field, which lead to the very heavy pollution in the soil and in the environment on the whole, and leading to the deterioration of the food quality in the end. And of course, there is some other issues. Some other issues are equally severe, which would with our attention as well. For example, exploitation on the water resources, including excessive fishery. And that is the major problems on the ocean use. On the other hand, we can take a look at the species which are invasive, which would lead to the economic loss. On the other hand, it would also lead to the loss of the habitat of some species which had been living in this particular habitat for a long time.
So actually, such issues exist in not just the freshwater, but also in ocean water. Another one is that the international food trade crisis has now directly and indirectly spread the coverage or the existence of exotic invasive species. Another big impact actually comes from climate change. According to scientists' estimates, about 30% of the carbon emission comes from a food system. And actually, there are different factors contributing to this 30% of the carbon emission, including the global anthropogenic GHGs, agricultural land use, methane from ruminant animals and soils, nitrous oxide, and others. So all these factors together account for 30% of the total global carbon emission, about 1/3. So to address climate change challenges, it is not just other industries that need to make their commitment and contribution. The food industry and agriculture industry need also to make their due contribution, and they need to adopt nature-based or nature-oriented measures to increase their adaptability and mitigation of climate change. So here, speaking of the global impact of climate change, we also need to look at the local and national level by analyzing how much of the national and local markets may contribute to the carbon emission and to the global warming, and also, more importantly, to the biodiversity loss around the globe. And all these factors have direct and indirect involvement in biodiversity loss in the past years. So given the overall framework of the biodiversity agreement, we really need to integrate our existing and potential resources and adopt new measures and practices to address these challenges. So speaking of the nature positive transition of food system, actually, there are a lot of measures we can do. For example, in the United Nations, there is action directions by 2030, which includes, first of all, the 20% of the degraded freshwater marine and terrestrial ecosystems are now under restoration. So this is included in the GBF2. Another one is about the 30% of globally land areas and the sea areas are now conserved. This is a GBF 3 and also SDG 6.6. And also there are many other measures in the biodiversity protection and genetic material protections and conservations and habitat conservations and many other areas. All these are closely related to the SDGs. In the interest of time, I wouldn't go into details, but I'm sure all these documents are available online, which you can refer to very conveniently. And if you should have any questions, we can have a further discussion after this meeting. Now, the World Economic Forum has selected 6 paths for transition as listed here: ecosystem restoration and avoiding land use expansion. Namely, these degraded land system, land, fresh water, and marine water in the biodiversity goal number 2 can be restored. At the same time, the existing land will no longer be exploited and will no longer be used as grassland or for other agricultural uses. And in that way, we could effectively reduce the pressures over the existing ecosystem. Well, the second one is to develop a productive and regenerative agriculture industry. This is actually a global trend to maintain the productivity of the food around the world while maintaining a low carbon and green development. And this is, again, a multidimensional framework that involves many different aims and purposes and targets. And in that process, it is really important to make sure that we protect the environment-friendly insects and also increase the biodiversity within a certain ecosystem through strengthening our efforts and increasing investment in protection of the biodiversity and the local ecosystem. So there are multiple solutions to that end. Well, the third dimension is about health and productive ocean, which means we need to have a better management over wild fisheries, and we need to do it sustainably. And also we need to transform and scale up a healthy aquaculture industry. And the fourth one here is the sustainable forest management, which means that we need to leverage the existing resources which are already insured to meet the demand of our economic and social development. At the same time, it is important to adopt certain measures and to conserve the ecosystem, and also while improving the diet and the nutrition of food in people's daily lives. And also it could be more effective if we could maximize the role of the waste generated in our daily life. So around the globe, there have been some studies analyzing the consumption of protein and other nutrients or nutritious elements in Africa, in Indonesia, in other developing countries. The per capita consumption of protein has been increasing very fast. And in some countries, that level is even higher than that in the developed countries. And now in African and Asian countries, there's a strong consumption capacity. So it is important for us to explore what kind of consumption level is a healthy one. At the same time, we need to study what is the threshold for the capacity of the earth to accommodate such a big amount of consumption. Another important is the transparent and sustainable supply chain and development. And through this, we can build a transparent and a traceable supply chain. I'm sorry, the internet connection of the speaker is not very well. So anyway, for that, we have the 6 transitions for the food, land, and ocean use system. Working together, we can create a 3.6 trillion annual business opportunities and 191 million jobs by the end of 2030, if properly managed. So in that process, I think there would be a lot of opportunities for businesses to leverage so that they can not only making themselves more profitable, but also making their contribution to the social and economic development of the whole world. Well, then another important thing is that we need to strengthen our partnership, and also we need to work together to better use the latest development of science and technology And also we need to make full use of the existing resources to come up with more incentives in a financial way or in other ways.
Thank you so much for my speech. Thank you for your attention. Many thanks to Dr. Zhu for your very informative and a very comprehensive introduction. Dr. Zhu has been long engaged with the IUCN and very specialized and very familiar to the topic that he has been introducing just now. And he actually has been very systematically introducing the relations between the food system and the biodiversity, the transition of the food system in progress to support the nature positive development and biodiversity. So right now, within a framework of the post-2020 biodiversity, well, some bullet points has been outlined and detailed by Dr. Zhu. The first one is to encourage the in positive utilization of the resources from the land, from the ocean. This is very critical aspect or very critical topic in all negotiation. And the second is the food system or agricultural system. And there are some subsidies which could be deemed as negative, and we have to look at it when we are engaged with any kind of negotiations. And for the transition and reforms or transformation of the food system itself can provide some positive points for the nature conservation and for the biodiversity. And that is very, very positive and a very encouraging message from this speech. So Dr. Zhu, especially at the ending part, you have emphasized that the transition of the food system can bring a lot of contributions to support nature positive agenda. So I don't know whether there's any very urgent questions and that need to be raised and addressed to Dr. Zhu, because right now I have seen there are more and more audiences joining us. So if you have any questions, you can drop the questions, ideas, and opinions and suggestions in the chat box. And then we will reserve them and to be addressed to questions to Dr. Zhu in the food system reform or transit. Right now, what is the current urgent situation right now? Because right now, there is some conclusion that the fast development of the agriculture system actually has posed a great impact on biodiversity already. MBS, apart from the solution supported by MBS, what is the biggest challenge in front of us? Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Peng, for this question. Well, actually, it's fair to say that this is like a very big question. And I'd like to be very brief to address this question. First of all, the distribution and allocation of the food resources is not equal and not fair. The total supply amount of the food is sufficient, but some countries, their consumption of food is excessive. Some countries located in remote and less developed countries and regions, they're suffering from lack of food. So this is the disparity of the distribution of the food resources. So the first and the foremost important issue for us is to how to satisfy everyone and satisfy the appetite and the demand of the food for all people in this world. Apart from that, the second question is how to formulate a system which is sustainable, which can also attain high and sustainable development of the food system. And that is very important as well, because that is for the future survival of human beings. And so right now we are working on the development of the new methods and the new measurements and new technologies and a cohort of technologies. and to find out the good way and a combination of different ways to maintain the sustainable food production system. And also, we have to maintain the nutrition demand from the human bodies. On the other hand, we believe that we have to reduce the excessive exploitation of the nature resources. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Zhu. There are some people dropping their questions, and we are collecting these questions one by one. And then we will attend to these questions if time allows for further discussion. Thank you again, Dr. Zhu, for your excellent remark. And the next speaker, we will invite the speaker, Dr. Linzi Lewis, and he's going to talk about the African cases for biodiversity in agricultural production. And she is a very specialist, a very good specialist, an artist and a specialist on biodiversity. Before 2016, he's always been working as a researcher for ACB, and ACB is dedicated in the sovereignty and sustainability of the agriculture development in Africa as a platform, and also focused on the research and the collection of resources for the development of the seeds and varieties of the food production to support the resilience against the disorderly development and expansion of the capitalist in the food production. And she is also very happy to attend this platform, and she is very happy to cope with these challenges that we have been alluding to, and to tackle the major challenges. And Dr. Zhu actually has shared with us there is a huge exploitation of the resources to expand the food production. Actually, the distribution of the food resources is unfair and unequal. So hopefully that from this aspect, we can share, and she can share with the findings and research results from the programs. And she specialized in a Witherstrong University, reaching the bachelor degree, and master degree in a livelihood development in Copenhagen University. Then in Montefiore University, she got master degree for biodiversity and biological development. So Dr. Lewis, the floor is yours.
Hi, Luis.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I just needed to stop sharing so I could unmute myself. I couldn't find it. Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Yes?
We can hear you and we can see your screen as well.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Sharon. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you for the invitation to present. I am Linzi Lewis, as has been introduced, a research and advocacy officer at the African Center for Biodiversity. Just to give an introduction to the ACB a little bit, the ACB carries out research, analysis, capacity and movement building and advocacy work, sharing information to widen awareness and catalyze collective action and influence decision-making primarily on issues of biosafety, agricultural biodiversity and farmer-managed seed systems, and the corporate power and expansion in African agro-food systems. So the ACB's work both aims to inform and amplify the voices of social movements fighting for food sovereignty in Africa. The overall objective of ACB's work is to strengthen food security in Southern and Eastern Africa by promoting seed diversity and agroecological practices. Specific objectives and linked to this are to secure biosafety in Africa, to secure agricultural biodiversity in Africa, and limit corporate expansion while ensuring farmers have alternative systems of support based on agroecology. So as it was also shared in the concept note for the session, agricultural biodiversity covers a wide range of a wide spectrum, really, including crops, livestock, fish, soil biodiversity, pollinators, agricultural landscapes, and these all serve for the basis of our food. Hello? And also these serve, as the basis of our social, cultural, and spiritual worlds. We have kind of co-evolved in this way. So this is just a little introduction. Let's see, why it's not letting me change. Let's see, let's check. Okay, so I also want to thank the previous speaker who has really set the scene to explain what the impact is of industrial agriculture and industrial food systems are on biodiversity. Of course, this is being driven by many activities, primarily in terms of land cover change, habitat loss, the upstream and downstream impacts, the incredible resource requirements to feed this system, and ultimately providing very little nutrition in the end. So it's a very problematic system. And I think, the previous speaker really outlined that very well for us. I'm not going to speak too much about that. Our focus as the ACB and what I'm going to cover in this presentation is primarily the role of farmer seed systems as part of agricultural biodiversity. And inherently linked to that is farmers' rights and the right to seed, which is something I'll explain a lot more as we continue. And this really being the basis for the transition towards biodiverse and a just agroecological system, which is what we're talking about really, right? So the need to transform these industrial systems heavily reliant on, or they're just monocropping, reliant on toxic inputs and serve that don't really serve people ultimately. So this is for us, kind of an inherent part of the argument. So the situation that we find ourselves in, as also has been mentioned, there are fewer than 200 of the world's approximately 6,000 food crop species that contribute primarily to global food production. And only 9 of these species contribute 66% of total crop production. And this is primarily sugarcane, maize, rice, potatoes, soybeans, oil palm, sugar beet, and cassava. And many of these crops are actually not even used for food production. They are also called flexi crops. And they're used in a variety of ways to manufacture various products in cosmetic industry, amongst others. And these are all really part of this industrialization of agricultural and food systems to feed corporate supply chains. And when it's produced for food, ultimately they are primarily feeding consumers of the global north. This push for industrialization focused on a very narrow notion of agricultural production to feed these industrial supply chains. As said, industrial agriculture is based on monocropping, relies on toxic chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and is intricately linked and tied to these global supply chains, with various corporate legislation that are used as the architecture behind this industrial system. And I'll speak a bit more about this as we go through the presentation, because this is really the heart of it. Importantly, industrial intensification, for us as we understand it, is an extractive practice that unsettles the foundation of all ecosystems and social systems, and leading to increased global rates of soil degradation. Speak briefly about as we move through the presentation. So this slide is not so clear, but the point is here that actually even this industrial system is a fundamental driver of malnutrition and hunger and malnutrition. So, and I think it's a very important point because it's often used to promote these type of systems, is that, oh, we need to feed a growing population. And it's incredibly misleading. especially when we're discussing agricultural production and its role on food security. In fact, it can be argued that the current direction of these food systems is actually a major cause of hunger and inequality, pushing farmers into low-wage exploitative labor as part of this as well. And often, you know, this land is being taken to farm just monocrops. So we argue that even this basic premise of these systems is fundamentally flawed and serves the interests only of a few. And I think that's a very important point. You know, I'm based in South Africa, and this is a case in point where hunger continues to escalate despite the fact that we are a food secure country with a very strong and dominating industrial agricultural and food system, and also a very strong formal seed sector, which is also focus is on seed, and it's where a lot of this discussion will go from here. So the source, right, seeds. Seed is really the primary input when we're talking about agricultural production. And it holds this, you know, generational knowledge, this genetic information to produce food and also to adapt to changing climatic conditions. So for us, yeah, there's a lot we can talk about around seeds. Broadly, there are two different types of seed systems: farmer seed systems and commodity seed systems. Commodity seed systems are dedicated to the reproduction of homogeneous varieties, dependent on chemical inputs through property regimes and contract law. The main purpose is to make profits and produce as much food as possible. These systems, industrial seed systems, rely on distinct, uniform, and stable criteria that's known as DUS criteria that are the base of these formal seed systems. And these link to international agreements such as UPOV, which is the International Union for the Protection of New Plant Varieties. So when we're talking about commodity seed systems, we're talking about the seed laws in countries, which basically allows or governs the trade in marketing of seeds. And then the other important law is around plant variety protection or plant breeders' rights. And these two really are the architecture of commodity seed systems. And when you look globally and across the African continent, more and more these systems are coming, these laws are coming into place, which not only, they focus on commodity seeds and commodity corporate, really agriculture, but ultimately they really criminalize and neglect farm seed systems, which is the base of agricultural production, you know, on this continent, and it is the history of how we've gotten to where we are today in terms of food, and have all this genetic information that we need as we move forward, especially in the context of climate change. And the plant variety protection law basically governs, as said here briefly, around property regimes on seed, on new varieties, and they are incredibly restrictive in terms of what is allowed to be sold, what is allowed to be reused, and ultimately undermines really the future of food, the future of seeds. And this is an area of work that the ACB works very strongly on across the continent, and of course in South Africa. And yeah, is a major problem, we would say, at the moment. Of course, linked to the system, we are seeing the push also for genetic engineering and the push for GM crops. And even now we're finding new versions, right? We call it like genetic engineering 2.0, which is really takes things a lot further than what we've already seen around genome editing, synthetic biology, and other emerging techniques that are really intrinsic to this industrial agricultural value chain and this logic really about how we need to produce food. And I think if there's any questions around this, we can discuss it a bit later. I'm not going to go into too much detail about all these different aspects. I'm just trying to give you a bit of a picture of the kind of threat and also the situation that we find ourselves. As part of this industrial seed system, this is a highly controlled and concentrated market. In the case of, basically there are 4 agrochemical companies that control 60% of the global seed market. and 75% of the global pesticide market. So, I mean, I think what also raises our eyebrows is the fact that the seed and pesticide companies are the same. And I think it really shows this very, very problematic overlap between corporate seed or this formal seed, we may call, there's often, there's hybrid seed, if people maybe know about that. This all tends to form part of the formal seed sector. And beyond that, it really makes farmers completely dependent on these expensive inputs provided by these companies because they are intrinsic part of the production system. On the other hand, we have farmer seed systems that are defined by long-standing continuous renewal of biodiversity in the field and the free distribution of seeds and knowledge among people. Seeds are often gifted, shared, bartered, bought and sold. Of course, people do also sell seeds in both informal and formal markets. And if you've come to Africa, you'll be very familiar with these markets. And these are the foundations of African food production, which is what feeds the continent. So farmer seed systems also make food systems much more resilient to climate change, to pests and pathogens, because these seeds are adaptable. That's the nature of them. They don't fulfill the distinct, uniform, and stable criteria because, and that's a positive thing, but because they do not, they are not allowed to be sold and traded in many countries, actually. And so, I mean, I think, yeah, this is the reality that we're facing, and then more and more the reality, especially on the continent. So, in terms of farmer seed systems, people really have been domesticating plants for approximately 10,000 years. This relationship is based on the continuous experimentation and adaptation on the field. And as a result, farmers have actually co-evolved and adapted genetic resources, resulting in the agricultural biodiversity we have today. Through this interaction between natural and farmer selection, farmers have driven innovation and agricultural biodiversity by selecting and saving seed of particular interest, growing and distributing seeds through these seed systems, through the farmer seed systems. And of course, in many parts of the world, there are specific individuals that do care and guard.
That was good, cuz.
Hello. Who care and guard their community seeds. And often women are the seed stewards or the seed custodians of their community. So of course, commodity seed systems rely on farmer seed systems to provide this raw material. And in turn, farmer seed systems depend on the rights of farmers to freely save, use, exchange, and sell seeds. Yet the high concentration of corporate power allows a relatively small group to restrict people's access to seeds and to shape markets and define even what is understood as innovation. And as I mentioned, it is very worrying that there's this neglect and even in cases the criminalizing of these seed systems.
This is so fucking confusing.
Sorry, somebody, if you can just mute everybody, that would be great. There are also other threats to these systems, such as the entry of genetically modified crops, particularly in centers of origin, which really threaten that entire crop and all the genetic information of those crops. And we are witnessing this in Africa as well, with the aggressive push for industrializing African agricultural and food systems. Really, that's taking place at all levels, at national level,
What's going on here, cuz?
And at the AU level. And this is despite the fact that farmer seed systems are the main source of seed for smallholder farmers. As an example, many millions of smallholder farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, most of whom are women, still supply 80 to 90% of all the seeds planted in Africa. I mean, this is massive. So yeah, basically the ACB with our partners in the African food sovereignty
Shut up.
have been I hope that wasn't directed at me.
Lindsay, just continue. I think someone has hacked into our system, but just continue. Yeah. So just go
Okay,
ahead.
thanks, Chris. Okay. Yeah, basically, we've been pushing back against this wave of corporate-orientated seed laws, biosafety laws, and these agricultural policies being pushed on the continent for the last 2 decades. So when we take just a look into Africa, as I said, there's really a massive push for the rapid industrialization of agriculture in Africa as part of this wider agenda, which for us is about deepening extraction on the continent of minerals, wood, water, food, fiber, genetic material, and even finance. And this is being done to feed the desires of the world's wealthiest consumers, but being framed as a development pathway for Africa. In many ways, there's a clear ideological divide, and we believe quite a bias and unscientific logic driving this capitalist economy, which is really perpetuating business as usual while biodiversity continues to plummet. Productivity is still centered in these discussions, and even in the conventional biological diversity, the CBD, and in the current development of the framework, the new framework for biodiversity, the Global Biodiversity Framework, this is still centered, despite the fact, as we just saw in the previous presentation, that agriculture is one of the major drivers of biodiversity loss, and this is industrial agriculture. So productivity in industrial agriculture is measured not in terms of human and environmental health, but exclusively in terms of commodity output and economic growth. The productivity paradigm that accompanies industrial intensive agriculture has disrupted carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycles and displaced long-standing regenerative integrated farming practices. And it's, we really desperately need to move beyond productivity and beyond these basic assumptions that are driving our economies and in fact driving perhaps our own extinction. Sorry that the quality is not so good of this picture either, but this image, which comes from the IPES food report, I'll show you a picture later, from diversity, I'll show it a bit later, which basically illustrates some of these other indicators that many experts are pushing for beyond productivity, which is a very narrow notion in itself, and moving from those particular aspects that are driving ecological collapse on the left, when you just focus, on net calorie production, on yields per hectare, productivity per worker, on income, to those that are also aimed more to support life and well-being of all living things and for our life supporting system. So nutrient content per hectare. In diverse production systems, you have diversity on the field. So you don't just measure calories, you measure the nutrient content and the total output, total biomass produced, nutrient availability, resource efficiency, how it has affected ecosystem services and livelihood security and resilience and social equity. So there are many ways that we could be looking at things quite differently. And I think when you start to look at agricultural biodiversity on the farm and mixed cropping systems and its interaction with the broader landscape, these are really things we need to consider, because as was mentioned previously, in monocropping and industrial foods agricultural systems, the soil is completely depleted of all nutrients, and the need then becomes for more and more synthetic fertilizer to be put on. But as the soil is depleted, the plants have no nutrients to uptake. So the plants are devoid of nutrients. So I think these things are just not looked at in any detail when we really examine why we're pushing for biodiversity and agricultural biodiversity. Also, to just say, even in the case of just looking at productivity, if you look at this image, even when the case of just looking at productivity being measured, even in that case, organic agriculture, in that case, had the same output, and even in some cases outcompeted industrial agriculture in terms of resilience when there was periods of drought. So, and this was after a 30-year study done by the Radali Institute. And this kind of information is crucial to combat the false and misleading claim being made for more uniform seeds, further intensifying of agriculture production, and to push for other false solutions, such as genome editing, etc., which really have massive risks and threats to entire ecosystems. So just to discuss a bit of the role of agricultural biodiversity as part of biodiverse agroecological systems, or rather, and this is the paper I was referring to, where a lot of this information in terms of, really a lot of data that exists, and there's many documents out there, but this was a good one done quite a little while ago now, from 2016. But in terms of, there's three main ways to understand agricultural biodiversity when we're examining the role of agriculture within a broader landscape. So the one is the kind of on-farm biodiversity, and this includes the in situ conservation and sustainable use of agricultural biodiversity, this genetic and agricultural biodiversity, and this includes crop populations, farmer seeds, which is often maybe mistermed as land races, crop wild relatives, etc. And this really holds the genetic information that we need and what also formal seed sectors need. And also, these are directly linked to agricultural production system itself in terms of intercropping, mixed farming systems, agroforestry, and this may include food, but not only food. It might include also medicines, insecticidal properties in plants. And this is why, you talk about the push-pull method. And so it's kind of looking at companion planting on site, which obviously also contributes to agricultural biodiversity, but also contributes to the fact that these production systems then may have positive effects on surrounding areas. They don't need additional pesticides. They provide a lot of microclimates, etc. And this really recognizes the mutual relationship between plants and the overall health of the production system. And this also improves dietary diversity, the nutritional availability of those plants, soil health, and all of this is really so interconnected.
Hello. 还有另外
that we need to consider is the way the farm relates and interacts with the surrounding areas, and also the way these surrounding areas and ecosystems affect agricultural areas. And of course, there's biodiversity there for on-farm, and then there's biodiversity where this agricultural area connects.
包括在农业区和非农业区之间有什么样的关系，能够形成什么样的互动，这点也很重要的。而且呢，尤其是在选种领域，那些我们推动整个生态
the broader landscape. Essentially, the future of food rests heavily on the realization of farmers' rights and the right to seed. And just to explain what these mean and why we push so strongly for this. In the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, under Article 9, farmers' rights is defined as the recognition of the enormous role played by local and indigenous communities and farmers in the conservation and development of plant genetic resources, which is the basis of food and agricultural production. The protection of relevant traditional knowledge, the right to participate in benefit sharing in PGRFA, and the right to participate in decision-making related to the conservation and sustainable use of PGRFA. UN DROP refers to the right to seed, and I'm not going to detail everything. If you look at Article 19 of UN DROP, it speaks in a lot more detail actually about what is the role of the state to make sure that local farmers are able to access local seed, adaptable seed. And in many ways, this goes quite beyond just the understanding that farmers, that the right to save, reuse, exchange and sell seed, which is what is understood. But that's really the minimum that needs to be there. And even that is being undermined. So basically, we are witnessing various threats to farmer seed systems, and of course to the future of our food production, and particularly in light of the multiple converging crises we're facing. Seed laws and plant variety protection laws are primarily linked to bilateral trade agreements and are having shocking impacts on local seed systems. Pesticides having terrible impacts on biodiversity and health of farmers and farm workers. New genetic engineering technologies with potential extinction technologies and the impact on and off farm. Even issues around access and benefit sharing, which are becoming more reliant on property rights and contractual transactions hidden within bilateral trade agreements. And there are many serious human rights concerns implicit in many of these discussions, and even more so with the whole discussion on digital sequencing information, which are on the horizon. And all of these are intersecting and interacting and have massive impacts on equity and human rights. So Just in closing, while countries are obliged to comply with their obligations under the CBD and of course other multilateral environmental agreements, unfortunately the reality in countries, many countries are moving in the opposite direction. And this is really the situation that is taking place on the African continent and especially at the AU level that is driving massive changes throughout the continent. This has massive impacts on local farmers' ability to adapt to changing conditions and has severe impacts on dietary diversity and ultimately threatens livelihoods, food and nutritional security now and in the long term, but also has longer term access to diverse crops that is limited to this changing climate conditions. So there is significant evidence pointing to the need to ensure farmers' rights are protected as the basis for a just and resilient food systems, as it is the foundation of agroecological production and therefore the basis of a just transition of our agricultural and food systems. There's significant evidence pointing to the dire situation of our agricultural biodiversity, including agriculture's role in driving biodiversity loss on farm and off farm, as well as its potential actually to change and alter this direction significantly. But unfortunately, this aspect is not even being addressed even as the GBF, as you said, is currently under negotiation. And for us, this is really the fundamental element when we're talking about of where things need to shift and how we need to rewrite our relationship with the planet, and really looking at smallholder farmers to guide us in this way so that we can uphold the rights of nature, farmers' rights, the right to self-determination. And it is vital that we shift this trajectory to phase out industrial agriculture and transition towards this more kind of ecologically sound and socially just agroecological system. So yeah, I think that's just it for me. Sorry, I'm not sure if you want me to do more case studies, but hopefully we can speak more about that in detail for questions. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Many thanks, Louis, for your very special contribution from very different aspects to talk about the biodiversity conservation and its relation with the sustainable production of food and also the food production in support of biodiversity. This is a very special angle from which we can see the direction of research and the direction of the theories is quite different from the incumbent research or the basis of research. So many thanks to your contribution for this very special angle to guarantee the fairness of the distribution of the rights and also to guarantee the rights of the farmers in the production of the food and to look at how to maintain sustainability and biodiversity from the aspect of the rights protection. There is a very interesting aspect contributed by Louis. While it's sufficient or not sufficient, it's not a matter of the quantity of the production or the food. It's a matter of the distribution of the food, which echo the point from the first speaker, Dr. Zhu, is actually talking about this issue from the angle of the guarantee of the supply equally among different geographies. So that will rouse a very interesting discussion, and we would have a 15-minute interaction, and the questions and ideas will be welcome. And there are some questions already dropped in the chat box, and I'd like to attend to the question addressed to Louis. Food production, if the sufficiency or not sufficiency issue of the food production is also related with the security of food. If food production is not a major issue, if the distribution of food is a more important issue, then the inadequacy of the food supply in Africa would be a very big issue which need us to attend to very urgently, and there is some problems. Probably right now, the quantity is something that most of the countries and most of the people would focus on instead of looking at how the food is distributed. So on this aspect, Louis, what is your detailed perspectives on the distribution of the food? And So the food production and about diversity and what kinds of issues that we have to tend to first and foremost for the relation between these two items. Louis.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, food security in itself is, you know, it's got many elements, right? The one is, you know, it's about production, it's about access, it's about affordability, and about the quality of food. It's about a few different aspects. And I think the fact that it's only focused so much on the production, about quantity, is where there's a problem. You know, definitely there's an issue around distribution of food, because if, but it's the entire system that's taking place. So if you're converting land that was previously producing food for local consumption towards export, but it's export of a very few monocrops that may or may not actually even be used for food production. So there's just like a trend taking place in that way that makes farmers and generally people, because obviously farmers produce for the local, primarily locally, and they, you know, that becomes inaccessible. It becomes food then has to be imported. So countries become less food secure as they enter the sort of global food chain, and because there's about, you know, there's export, GDP, all these measurements that are saying, well, this is what we need to do to get investment. But then locally, it increases vulnerability, and of course, increases food insecurity, because food becomes more expensive, is less nutritious, is less accessible, and more concentrated in specific areas. And so there's kind of, yeah, I think the question is not so maybe as simple. I think there definitely is issues across the continent that need to be addressed in terms of, you know, we do have things like desertification, we do have specific issues. Climate change will affect the way food can be produced. And so, but if we consider more diverse systems that like work within microclimates and, you know, really look at it from quite a, in this more holistic way, then you can produce high quality and it can be also feed locally. But our systems don't operate like that. And so it also comes down to how the state can support, you know, local value chains. And I think it's really this question of like global value chains. Why is that the prioritized versus local value chains, and why that would probably promote more food security for farmers who are incredibly food insecure, actually, because of this very unstable economy, unstable climate as well. So there's, and then all the people that are dependent on local farming. So I think it's multifold. I think we do have an issue, but I wouldn't say it's a production issue. I think it's a systemic issue.
Brilliant. Yeah, Louis, I think your points are very novel and very unique, very thought enlightening. Yes, some audience, like Fritz, also raised some question correspondingly, and this question is from the production and consumption aspect. Production and consumption is one of the two of the most major elements leading to the loss of biodiversity. So to tackle the biodiversity issue, right now, we are diverting less attention to the producers, so the individual producers, the farmers, and their rights is actually insufficiently protected. And for the globalization of the food system, actually the globalization of the food system is one of the major enablers to guarantee biodiversity from agriculture perspective. So I also want to invite invite this answer. So Dr. Zhu, the question is yours. Thank you. Many thanks to Fritz for the question. It's a very important and a very critical issue. Right now, we can see that the globalization of food system is indeed bringing a lot of issues, and from the production and from the consumption aspect, from both ends, the production and consumption side. We have to try our best to come up with some solutions.
So it is even more important for producers to invest more so that they can enjoy more equality while producing more food and enjoying all the benefits. So speaking of trade itself, it is an important tool for us to optimize global resources and saving resources. But still, there are some inequality in the food system. Some people can benefit and some people cannot. So it is important for us to have a better trade governance throughout the global market to ensure fair and just trade in the global market. Particularly, we need to pay attention to the local communities and the residents and farmers so that they can really benefit from the improved food system in the world. At the same time, incentives should be given to support a healthy and a reasonable consumption of food. At the same time, it is important for us to reduce waste and to have a more sustainable way of living and production of food. And I think these important issues are all closely related together and must be resolved through joint efforts and also through multiple solutions at different dimensions and levels. Thank you. Well, thank you, Dr. Zhu, for sharing. And I have seen a very wonderful comment who believes that there might be some flexibility right now, but it is not enough because there are some surplus in production, but also there's a surplus consumption. So it might need some flexibility that may cause the biodiversity loss. One of the reasons might be that this flexibility is not enough. Maybe it is possible that we can pay more attention to the transition of the local food system. So according to this commentator, there's no specific solution he proposed. And so any ideas from Dr. Zhu, please? So for me, okay. Yeah. And of course, we need to give priority to meet the needs of the local markets. But from the global perspective, there are some regions are resource tight in terms of water or others. Maybe for these kind of regions, they couldn't be self-sufficient. So they have to rely on international trade to meet their needs. And they need to rely on the food and agricultural products from the surrounding areas or from international trade. For example, in Cape Town, in New York, cities like this must rely on international trade system for food and agricultural products. So anyway, and still, it is preferred that the products or food come from the local market first. And also regional and international trade are important and inevitable parts. Yes, indeed, quite reasonable. But when we're speaking of local supply to meet local demands, as a matter of fact, the local community sometimes do not have the sufficient resources to meet the local demands. So to some extent, globalization could be one of the solutions, seemingly. But still, that being said, we really need to say that the local communities or the local markets need to have a certain flexibility to make sure the local market supply and the international supply can supplement each other. So how do you balance that, Lindsay? And how do we solve these kind of conflicts or contradictions? Lindsay, over to you.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I actually didn't catch the whole question. So sorry. My internet is giving me some problems.
Okay, can you hear me now? Lindsay,
I
can you
so
hear me now?
sorry.
Okay, Dr. Zhu also shared with us about the globalization of the food and also the importance of local food market. So now if we look at the overall global ecosystem and the geological locations and meteorological conditions, the local food supply may not be sufficient to meet the local demand. So they also need food supply from the global market. So facing these situations, perhaps the globalization might undermine the equality, but still the local market needs to have a certain ability to meet their needs. So there might be some contradictions and some challenges. How do we strike a balance between the local supply, local demands, while being supplemented by the international markets? How much self-sufficiency should the local community have, and how much food they can get from the international market? How do we strike a balance? That is the question.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you for that. I mean, I wonder, to be honest. Of course, one cannot produce everything locally. You know, not everywhere can produce wheat. You know, so you need to import. You know, and I understand that there are some limitations around one's entire food coming from a local source. But I do feel, you know, that this is being pushed really beyond that limit at the moment. I feel like, you know, as Fred has mentioned in the chat, you know, in many cases, local markets could meet the demand, and they are being undermined in many ways. Talk about chicken, for example, you know, that gets dumped on the African continent because it's cheaper to produce in the US and dump it rather than supporting local farmers who therefore cannot compete at all with that situation. And, you know, especially because there's so much food waste, especially in the global north. I feel like there's a big distortion actually around the discussion. I don't think people are saying no to any imports, but local production should be supported and promoted first. But that's not what's really taking place. What's taking place is transforming local agriculture for export markets and then becoming reliant on imports, imports of food, imports of seed, imports of fertilizer. As you saw, like, you know, during COVID, a massive issue was the fact that we couldn't import not only food, but you couldn't import seeds anymore, and the fertilizers and the pesticides reliant. So the fact that you couldn't even import seeds because it's become such a dependency on imports across the entire system. I mean, this is really the heart of the problem, because yes, of course, you know, farmer seed systems, speak about that. They don't, like, one local market might not have all the seed. It's not that. It's about, it interacts with the broader society, you know, and I think that's normal, and that might even cross boundaries, you know, national boundaries, of course. So I don't think the question is that. It's about, where do we put our energy? What is making more vulnerability? What is creating dependencies, you know? And I think we're seeing more and more dependencies. And this is, of course, going to be an incredible problem when more disasters strike, because you cannot get those imports anymore. But what you find when you see with COVID is that local systems were still existing and were what was required to continue to feed people. So I don't think we're saying no to all imports, but I think, you know, there is a massive distortion of what's going on, the impact not only on equity, but on the quality of food, on livelihoods, on incomes, you know, so you know, there's lots of layers to that, and who's actually benefiting ultimately are larger corporations, or even, you know, in northern companies, and if anything, local elites only, while everybody else is sort of suffering. And are still going hungry. So I'm not sure it's offering the solution that we're speaking about. And I don't know how you deal with I think the conflict is being distorted. I think that's my feeling on that.
Oh, thank you, Lindsay, for sharing wonderful response, which helps us better understand the close connectivity between food system and biodiversity, because this is actually beyond productivity or beyond the distribution equality. We really need to focus more how to find a solution to strike the balance. And also we have one of the audience proposing a question to Dr. Zhu. So the question is, how do you make of China's agricultural industry? Because right now in China, many people prefer organic agricultural products, because that is number one, more sustainable, more green, and also it is healthier. But frankly speaking, organic food or organic products are far from being enough to meet the market demands, even if these kind of products are sustainable and environmentally friendly. So, Dr. Zhu, how do you make of that? Thank you for the question. Thank you, our moderator. And this is another important issue. Organic agriculture, in the long-term agriculture development in Chinese history, actually, it is a very important part, particularly for a country with such a big population. And organic agriculture has played a certain role in providing food to Chinese population. But to be frank, if we have a complete organic food production or agricultural production, then I believe it is insufficient to meet the demand from such a big population. And there have been some cases in China, and also we have seen some very detailed studies in China. So it is important for us to protect the productivity of Chinese agricultural industry, and we need to make sure the market has a sufficient food and agricultural product supply. At the same time, we need to see that we make enough efforts to mitigate pollution and the overuse of fertilizers and pesticides, because in some places we do see some unreasonable and unscientific usage of fertilizers and pesticides. Such practices must be mitigated as much as possible. But what my point here is that we need to make sure our land is healthy, is fertile, which can bring us a higher productivity. But at the same time, we need to make sure that we must keep pollution under control. And whatever we do in this in this agricultural development, we need to make sure that we do not pollute our environment, we reduce carbon emission, and also we promote the healthy and greener development of our industries. And also we need to adopt a more sustainable and healthier practices in our irrigation system, in water saving, in fertilizing, and particularly in protecting our biodiversity. And also we need to make sure that we have a healthier agricultural structure in maintaining a healthy and sufficient productivity of our agriculture industry while protecting our ecosystem, our environment, and our biodiversity. And that requires systematic and comprehensive efforts and investments. And because doing a good job in conserving our environment and ecosystem and protecting our biodiversity to some extent can help us improve our productivity. I believe there are not contradictions.
A single solution doesn't work, both for a local community or to the whole world. It is unreasonable to have a silver bullet or the unified solution across the whole regions. And we have to look at the different conditions at the local level to come up with the solutions based on the manpower, resources, and the element of the resources in this local area. But of course, that is a matter of making a balance, and the nature-based solution is the core. And as for where it needs to be produced and what kind of products need to be produced at whatever place, it need to be as per requirement of the local authority and also the local community's request and the local conditions. So hopefully that this question can be addressed based on the balanced solutions. And hopefully that I have answered the question. Thank you, Dr. Zhu. Yeah, there is a lot of comments from the chat box. And yes, you can check on this chat box in the following session. And experts, if you have any time or interest, you can also participate in the discussion in the chat box, and more people will join us. And yes, this is a very popular topic. And both of these speakers in their presentations, you have pointed out some questions and issues as well as the direction of the solutions. And actually the next speaker, which would be the second Chinese speaker, who is very experienced in both research and in-field development, has been engaged in the research on the theories, and he has led his teams in the local areas of China's rural mountainous areas to observe and to accumulate experiences from the in-field experiments and to come up with a lot of solutions. And Dr. Zhang Gaoming, and he is the professor of the Institute of Botany of China's Academy of Sciences and post-professor of University of China's Academy of Sciences, and also he's the specialist and advisor of the arid region of United Nations University, deputy editor of the Journal of Plant Ecology, and he has been long engaged in the theories development and practical research of plant ecology and ecological agriculture for a long time. And he has been engaged in how to guarantee the production of the food system, at the same time guarantee the ecological sustainability and about diversity. Yes, we believe that the ecological agriculture somehow cannot satisfy the demands of the different people and groups of the people in the population. But actually, Dr. Zhang, during the research, discovered that probably that would not be true, because in some areas with sufficient conditions, we can guarantee the production and productivity of the food system. At the same time, the environment could also be conserved very efficiently and effectively. So with that, I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Zhang. So the floor is yours, Dr. Zhang, to talk about the conservation and utilization of agricultural biodiversity. Thank you. Can you hear me? Am I audible? Yes, very clear. So please share with us your PowerPoint. I'd like to share my PowerPoint first. Can you see the shared screen now? Many thanks to Dr. Zhu. I'm very happy to attend this dialogue on this platform on biodiversity, and I began engaged with this very special topic for a long time, too long time actually. And I really want to re-endorse what has been alluded to by the previous two speakers. And I also have posted some questions. Yes, the foods products must be combined out of the production, and so the result of the discussion also need to be combined definitely from this platform. And this is our team member. We have dozens of the units, and Chinese Academy of Science is the leading unit, and we also have the cohort of the Research Institute on the slides, and we also have the foreign partner from France and from Belgium, and so on and so forth. So what is the problem that we want to address today? First of all, let's take a look at the food and about diversity as well as the relations between these two. The background of the research. For the agriculture, probably every time we talk about quantity, how it can be consumed. And as for the question of distribution or fair distribution of the food, is something that we always miss or reserve for future discussion instead of discussing now. For China, the waste of food is a very severe problem. I agree with this point. So in the production process of the food, there is excessive use of fertilizer, pesticides, and in some areas, the wheat production is very high, but that is not a safe food with excessive use of all of these chemicals and the hormones and the mulch and herbicides and so on and so forth. Right now, in some areas, the lands are always available and even given to the farmers free of charge. And then they can plant and they can crop on this land. But in the end, these farmers, when they're cropping is not their main livelihood. They probably would take it as just another channel for making money. And we can see the waste of the land and the waste of the food. This double waste could be very serious, and we can see the degradation of the quality of the land. And we can also see the losses as well as the poor quality of the biodiversity in the croplands. So right now, the major diseases, for example, the high blood pressure and the diabetes, and these are the problems or the healthy problems faced by human beings, which could be partly or mainly by the lack of the quality guarantee of the land and the crops. And the cost could be very high for all of these issues. If we want to address these issues, the cost can be very high. And industrial production of the food will consume 70% of the nature resources. And so right now, we can see due to some solutions implementation, this number has been decreased, but not low enough. And the pesticides, yes, we use the pesticides to kill pests, but the population and the size of the pests is even bigger than before. Let's take a look at the figure in here. This is the China's figure. And Mr. Zhou Shuwen in 1911, there are 2,630 recorded years of recorded history before 1911. It has been recorded that in Chinese history, there is a disaster featured by pests. The number is 645. And when it comes to 1949 or in 1950, 1 year later, we have discovered 11 different species of pests, and 8 of them are very malicious. And after 70 years of the prevention and control and the fighting against this pest species, right now, the size of the species is 739 in China available right now. You can just see them. So the fight against them, after we use the fertilizers and the pesticides and the herbicides, the sizes as well as the types of the pests are even exploded. And before 2017, accorded by the Ministry of Agriculture, the pesticide types had been used in the croplands as altogether 38,247, and pesticides 14,865. To why the sizes and also the types of the pests are even bigger than before? This is really interesting topic for us to consider. If we don't kill them, probably the number of them will be lesser or will be smaller. That is our assumption. And so a lot of netizens pose a question like, if we don't use the pesticides, people will starve. But in our research, we decided that the answer is no, because in the world, on the globe, the carbon produced is about 100 billion tons, and human beings is only less than 7 billion, or almost 7 billion already. And the nitrogen coming from the air or atmosphere. So let's take nitrogen as the basis for calculation. There are three major accumulatives from the waste from the orchards, from the parks, and from the croplands, from the domestic waste. Yes, all of these excrements and also this ecological so-called fertilizers need to flow back to the cropland. And not only cropland or the fields for the crops, the orchards also could be included. And only relying on this agreement application on this croplands and orchards and parks and the tree fields and whatsoever, actually it is sufficient enough to guarantee the production of the food or the production of the plants and satisfy the demand of human beings already. And if we are looking at this chart, we can see this is a cycle. And Mr. Chen, Mr. Hongyi, and there is a theory developed by Mr. Hong, which is about the fully utilization of the biodiversity can satisfy the demand of human beings for food already. In Shandong province, about 16 years ago, we have discovered more than 10,000 of these species and more than 14,000 types of the fertilizers. And we discovered more than 14,000 pests. So we can make use of the theories of the biology in the eyes of the people, in the eyes of the ordinary people. When the cows are raised, they can produce excrements or manure, and the manure could be collected and flow back to the cropland as a fertilizer. And the production or the productivity could be enhanced, and production volumes in the per unit cropland could be enhanced. In Shandong province, it actually can produce a lot more than the incumbent solutions. And 600 million tons is enough, actually. So we don't use fertilizer, we don't use the herbicides and also the mulch and the hormones and the transgenic genes, seeds. So the result is very encouraging because 80% of the stores could be converted into something useful, and then it can enhance the productivity of the cropland in the end. So when we are doing the experiment, these are the ordinary people and these are the stores discharged by the farmers, and they are disposed in here and composed together. And actually, we can make use of the manures from the cattle, from the cows, from this animal husbandry ranges. Right now, after more than 10 years of the development, we can see the huge and disruptive and fundamental changes from these rural areas, from these villages. They could be very clean and unpolluted at all, very clean and clear. They have become the role model of the clean villages in China. So here, this is the biodiversity model. It doesn't have to be very big. It could be operated in a closed loop manner. And like 1 hectare of the cropland is enough. And it is enough to afford the management over 66 species, like the animals of different types and species, together with the different types of the plants and crops, could be raised and planted and developed together simultaneously within a very small lines, and can produce 150,000 RMB yuan for the household. And that is directly linked to the consumption side because it can be sold directly to the consumption side. It could create a lot of values and benefits, like the 10 mu equals to the production of 140 mu from other countries, because it is highly productive and it is highly integrated and highly diverse in terms of the different types and species of the animals and the plants it could produce. So it could be also directly sold to the tables and the market and whatsoever. So this is the shelf life. It has been expanded and prolonged very tremendously. You can see the varieties and how various it is.
So here we call it a BMOF, a model, which is the biodiversity management of organic farm. So here, this model can benefit farmers. Eventually, the farmers can benefit 100,000, but the majority would go to the companies. So ideally, the farmers can have at least 50,000 or 60,000 or even 100,000. At the same time, they can better use their fertilizers and they can do better in mitigating the pests and diseases. So here, how to address the challenges by pests? One solution is chemical solutions, which can be dated back for like 100 years in history. So here, we now start using physical. We use this moth-killing light or lamp. Very good, very effective, and also very environmentally friendly. One light can cover 15 more of land. Here, another important concern is about pests. And I had my students collect data about all these different pests. Actually, you can see all these insects caused some decrease of the productivity of the local crops. About biomass, if we collect the information of all the insects, you can see that they will have the impact of about 30 or 40% of the productivity of each mole. So actually, we have to be very careful using pesticides and other ways. So it is important for us to resort to some modern technologies. For example, for some specific kinds of pests, for example, like the aphid or aphids, if we use pesticides to kill those aphids, then we would kill those the lady beetles, which are actually useful in agricultural production. So here, one good way is to use this pulse lamp trap or this specific lighting system to kill those pests without using pesticides. So actually, it means that we can not only effectively kill those pests, but also reduce the environmental pollution by a large scale. So here, these are the beetles, the lady beetles killing the orphis. And here, this is the picture of the farmers collected all the kinds of insects and used these insects as a chicken feed because they are high in protein and they are very nutritious food for chicken. And also, you can see we can use other agricultural wastes to use them as a feed for chickens And also we can see that we are now having egg supply surplus using these wastes or pests as a feed for the chicken. These are the pictures. And also we can have this very dynamic and a very interactive system of using the ranch, using the surrounding areas and different kinds of pests to generate this synergy, not only making sure that we have enough productivity and enough agricultural product supply, but also making full use of the existing natural resources and even the insects. So many people may be concerned about the lower productivity, but actually that is not a concern, because at the fourth of the year, the application of modern technologies already brought the productivity up to the normal level. So far, this, I believe, the organic content of this Shandong province has now been increased by 5%. I think this is of great potential in the future market. Another one is a long-term polluted soil produced really bad peanuts. And then we started to use some organic methods to grow peanuts without using fertilizers, membranes. And you can see on the right side, the peanuts are really healthy. So here we can see that we also effectively drove down the price of these peanuts, because we can use this very, very positive cycle. And here you can see the pictures of the effect of peanuts, that we use our moth-killing lights without membranes. But on the right bottom, you can see if we use pesticides and membranes, the results are quite limited. And here you can see we use crop stocks, which means that they can produce green energy and organic fertilizer. So we can actually form this synergy of different factors. So we're not just talking about productivity of food. It is actually the result of multi-factors working together in an integrated and scientific way. And here we use our combination or integrated model to manage our fruit parks without using fertilizers or pesticides. And also here we can use bees to complete the pollination process. And here you can see this is the organic fruit part. And also we no longer use any kind of additives and pesticides and fertilizers. And actually at the very beginning, 2 years, the productivity was not as high as that of before, but actually 2 years later, the productivity of apple is actually far more than the original one. Another example is here, we use straw as the source of feed and energy and fertilizers for the soil at a cattle ranch. And here is another example, making full use of the local resources to raise geese. And these are some of the organic products. You can see the colors of these products are even better than those with fertilizers. And actually you can see very good results in terms of pest control. Another important measure we adopted is to make full use of the biodiversity of weeds, and we turn these bad weeds into something valuable, because in fruit parks, they can maintain the water content of the soil, and it can help improve the quality of the soil. At the same time, we can raise some animals or like the chicken or the geese to kill some of the pests. And then you can see to some extent, these animals can help us to kill the pests while mitigating weeds. In the latter part of our project, we found that the weeds can really generate different kinds of benefits. One of them is that it can help us strike a balance of the local food chain and ecosystem in the dense with weed model without compromising the productivity of the agricultural products. And here we can use weeds to attract the pests, and then we can use animals to help us keep a balance of running those parks. So here we call it a dance with weeds model. And here we can see that this kind of modern integrated methods really help us generate many unexpected results. So here, in terms of economic benefits, we can see for every the farmer would benefit at 2,000 RMB. But if that productivity goes up, then they can make out of 5,000 per moo, then they would rather go back home running their farms instead of going to the cities working as migrant workers. So here we can see more than 10,000 of our partners distributed in the coastal areas of China. So we're now trying to see if we can make further investment and efforts to make sure that these kind of models can be disseminated to the eastern and middle part of China. And here you can see this is the distribution of this model in different parts of China. In those economically developed areas like Guangdong, Shandong, Beijing, Zhejiang, Shanghai, Jiangsu, and these are most densely distributed areas, but in the middle and western part of the area, these areas are important potential areas that we are hoping to apply our models. Because we are now having this big picture of economic development, we will develop the coastal and eastern part of China first before going to the middle and the western part. And here, if we stop using chemical fertilizers and start using more physical or more environmental friendly measures, we can not only improve the productivity, but also improve the results of environmental protection and biodiversity protection. Well, that's all for my presentation. Well, thank you, Mr. Zhang, for your wonderful presentation, which shared with us a very, very important information. So indeed, a very impressive and informative speech. And I believe your speech has already triggered and inspired different response and questions. So as you said, the application of these models will not cause the decrease of productivity. Rather, it can not only maintain or increase the productivity while making better biodiversity and environmental protection. So it is very good that you combine your theoretical research results with real practices and apply these practices, various results into practices and generate obvious benefits. So very impressive, very, very valuable application. And obviously from this example, we can see that you have collected a large amount of scientific evidence to support the success of your models and methods. Now the floor is open. Let's see if the audience have any questions to our speaker. So now floor is open for questions. Well, then we have about 10 more minutes for discussion. So I will put the questions all together. And I've seen some questions typed in our chat box. Some of them said that in your practice, I think many of your cases are evidence-based, which generate very impressive results. So both in terms of academic research and in terms of investment, we see that you do have, and your team and you do have invested a lot, not just the time and money and energy. So how can you make sure that such model can scale up even up to the national level? Well, about scale up, I think it is up to whether the farmers are determined to use this. And then we also need to have the support of the local governments as well.
So if the cost or the expenses on killing the moths and the pests could be subsidized or replaced by something else, then the production cost could be actually reduced or abated. And this is something the government need to do and intend to. That would involve a lot of other discussions, like whether or not the productivity can really enhance by reducing the cost or expenses on the pesticides and herbicides and so on and so forth. So 200 kilograms of the output is not a problem right now. But if we apply extensively across the whole country, because right now the intensive production type of the food system is not sustainable and highly wasteful. But of course, we have to further lower the cost as close to the affordability of the farmers right now. And right now, the investment in 500 mu is very high, and it is unaffordable. So I think for the biological crop field experiment, it doesn't need any herbicides. It doesn't need any chemical traps. And this kind of expense actually could be abated and even reduced and even phased out. We have made it. And yes, we made it on the cropland of 500 mu, and we have already done and worked it out in even bigger crop fields with thousands of mu. Yes, there's a lot of problems coming to us. I just want to select one of them due to the time interest. And this one is very interesting. After more than 10 years of research, you have seen the power. We have witnessed the power of the research and the findings from research. In the early years or within a short period of time, when the results or positive results could not be combined, how can we really enhance the confidence on this road? Yes, for the farmers, they have to look into the future. The current industrial production could not sustain and unaffordable. Actually, it even will sacrifice the rights of the people or rights of the farmers. So ideally, we would look at it as scenario, as the best scenario, when the climate is not extreme, when the weather are okay and very mild. This is just a type as a teaser to arouse the interest and to become popular among the farmers, to let them in and to get their bites. For example, if I can abate 3 yuan per mu as a cost reduction for them, then they would join. So I think for the prior year or the early years, we'd better throw some teaser, and the rest of the things need to be handled by the government and supported by the government. So for example, for the hospital, yes, the all people health guarantee and the medical security has already been encouraging and very good and positive among all of the people. And it is the same truth and applicable to the biological agriculture. because otherwise it will not sustain. And yes, the publicity issue is very challenging in the beginning years. There is another question, because this is also the question raised by a lot of people. The practices of this model is very vivid and very pragmatic and very friendly to the environment and friendly to the biodiversity. The question is, if we really want to implement this experiment or apply this experiment with this model, what are the major barriers if it is applied to other localities or other local areas? The biggest barrier would be the concept or the philosophy of the people, the mindset of the people, especially the farmers. They first of all need to accept this model. They need to understand and comprehend, and they need to buy this type of thing. And because otherwise they will refuse. And the first instinct will say no to this type of production. And there's a lot of misleading concepts from some so-called experts. They say that if you don't kill the moths, if you don't kill the pests will grow even faster. And this is misunderstanding and misteaching from these experts to the farmers. And on the market, if the prices are the same for the feed and for the food, it is unreasonable. Many thanks to you. Good. Thank you. So Louise is still online. So if Louise is online as well, you must have heard the practical cases and experiments from Dr. Zhang. And part of the confusions about the small farmers' resilience has been partly tackled and answered. The importance of the biological type of production is important, and also the capacity of the farmers can also be enhanced by the biological production model. So in your aspect, is there anything valuable about this model? And will these solutions tackle the confusions that you would have? So Luis, are you online?
Hi, yes. Thank you so much to the presenter. I think it's really great to see, this, because we need this kind of evidence to say, what works, what doesn't work. And I feel like even the question that was posed to me about the potential conflicts of local production versus global production, in some ways is answered here, that there are examples of this taking place. And also discussing the range of other things that I didn't go into any detail in my discussion, but of the role of biodiversity across the board, first of all, for the agricultural system to enhance productivity. And I think I mentioned that in some ways briefly, to enhance soil fertility, which again enhances productivity, the multiple aspects around productivity, also when you have diverse crops on site. And potentially also more income that's possible from especially organic agriculture. The issue around seed is perhaps, there's a lot of problems around seed, because even for organic farmers, it's quite difficult to get, organic seed. A lot of seed that is sold on the formal sector is treated seed. So it's treated with fungicides. It has you'll find organic farmers often have to wash that fungicide off the seeds because it can't be considered organic. And so it's very difficult to get organic seed as a result, especially because it's very dominating sort of formal seed sector. And it would be very interesting to know a bit more about China's seed systems actually, and how how corporate seed is maybe affecting that, because there's a lot of issues around that, and you have to continue to buy that seed. You can't reproduce it, you can't really save it, and so I think that there's a lot there. The organic sector in many parts of the world is also actually pushing for the recognition of this type of, we call it, genetically diverse seed, and perhaps China's also moving in some of that direction. Definitely in Europe, they're working in that direction, and it's opening up avenues to look at this. And I think in Africa, it's quite different, and the organic sector is not necessarily linked so much to smallholder farmers. Of course, it is also organic, but organic agriculture can also be large-scale monocropping potentially as well. I'm not sure how the presenter might think about, the role of agricultural biodiversity. Obviously, there's like a wealth of food crops and the weeds and the this and the that can be actually used, that are used. I mean, in Africa, the weeds are a massive part of the diet. I wouldn't call them weeds, right? And I talk about leafy vegetables and massive part of the diet. Yes, they are, being eroded like directly through pesticides. So I don't know, there's a lot of questions maybe I have also to understand the Chinese systems, but I think, yeah, it's really wonderful to see practical examples really saying, look, this does work. And there are examples in other places, and we just need more of this to say, this is not so out of the blue, out of the box. It's actually very, very possible and is actually happening. So thank you. Yeah.
Well, then, thank you very much for your sharing and response. And also, we have heard something very interesting from Mr. Zhang, that it is a highly evidence-based presentation. It uses scientific research methods and also collect scientific evidence-based cases and applications, and also the results of these applications. And he also published a lot of publications. And so please, if you're interested in his publications, please refer to these documents and articles to have more data and information. Now we have some final questions, but Zhou Chunchen has to leave our meeting room because of other important meeting. So the final question is that for biodiversity conservation, how do you make of the measures in agriculture industry to address climate change? And what do you think are the important factors in agricultural industry to address climate change challenges? And how can we find some overlaps that we can do to, on the one hand, address climate change, while on the other hand, promote agricultural development? Yes, thank you for the question. Of course, climate change will cause a lot of climate crisis, the drought, famine, and others, and flood, etc. And actually, agricultural production caused 30% of the impact on the climate change. And actually, for this year, for example, those corn with weeds have now increased its productivity to 600 kilograms per mu. So actually, it can be really tolerant to drought. So I believe that the modern technologies applied in agriculture can really help us address climate change. So that means we believe that there are many different models of agriculture, including marine agriculture, the other types of agricultures. But anyway, agriculture is closely related to climate change. So the more modern technologies are applied in this new modern agriculture, the more benefits we can bring to our climate. So Lindsay, any response from your side, please?
Yeah, sure. I think, I think it's quite well documented that agriculture has, especially industrial agriculture, has a massive impact on driving the climate crisis. It's high resource intensive, and also with the inputs and the globalization of inputs and outputs. So the industrial agriculture system is a massive, I think it's like a third of climate emissions that come from just the industrial agricultural system. So it plays a massive role in driving climate change, landscape loss, just the change and use, the change in land cover, change in land use has a massive impact on so there's many issues around how the agriculture actually, industrial agriculture drives the climate crisis. There's a lot of information out there on it. And then conversely, we do believe that there is a role in agriculture to change or to redirect. The one is to obviously prevent emissions, and that would require also just a drastic reduction also in the use of inputs, which are very, very polluting, and the kind of machinery, unfortunately, as well, that is linked to that. But yeah, there's a lot of, I think also increasing the ability of the land to kind of the albedo effect, all these different aspects. Agriculture and biodiversity can have a role, but at the same time, I think while it might have some mitigation possibilities, the focus may be more on its adaptation role. To put too much, I believe, from a mitigation perspective, to say like, well, it can absorb emissions through biodiversity, and that is quite a misleading discussion. It's more about the real direct impact on climate change, on greenhouse gas emissions, on that whole discourse has to really be the focus. And I think industrial agriculture plays a massive role, but it's the changing to a more agroecological production system will affect that, and also will allow us to adapt to these changing conditions. And seed is really fundamental, because if you don't have seed that can adapt, which is what's happening right now in the corporate seed system and the commercial seed system, we're going to have a massive problem, because the seed is not designed for that. And then more technological sort of fixes are being offered, but it's not dealing with the root issue that we're finding around it, in terms of how we're going to actually be able to adapt to more drier conditions, more hotter conditions, for example.
Well, thank you, Lindsay, for your sharing. Now, some of the audience is now looking forward to see if you could provide your contact information. So please, if you don't mind, you can, could you please share your email box? Because we have some colleagues from Africa who would like to keep in touch with you. Well, then now, in the interest of time, we now come to a successful end of this workshop, and briefly wrap up what we have discussed for this afternoon session. And our speakers shared their perspectives from different angles, but we have a very comprehensive introductions from 3 speakers who shared us from their own specific fields, international experience, domestic experience, and also real cases to inject some confidence in our future. And also, more importantly, it'll bring us more inspirations and confidence in making more investment and commitment to biodiversity protection. So agricultural biodiversity and also on the urban biodiversity conservation, and all these are important issues that are the center of our attention. And now crop production and climate change, biodiversity loss are all closely related with each other. So these areas are facing a lot of challenges. So these issues correspondingly deserve our close attention, research, studies, and also we're looking forward to more opportunities to share our wisdom, our research results, so that we can contribute our part into this big cause of great significance. So if you should have any questions or any further comments or responses, you can use ECMA, you can use visit our websites, and also you can contact with CSABC and ACBA. And we have left the contact information here. You can either send emails or scan the QR code here. And we will continuously, as we have always done in the past, have further discussions on other important issues. And we're looking forward to our next session and welcome to join us next time. And now with that, we conclude this afternoon session. Again, let me thank all the speakers, Lindsay, Dr. Zhu, and Mr. Zhang. I would also thank our colleagues from AGBA and also NGEI and the Association of Biodiversity. And also with that, I conclude this session and looking forward to the next meeting. Thank you. Goodbye.